If we were to select the moment in human history when we came closest to extinction, the top choice would undoubtedly be the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. During the confrontation, both sides had prepared over 3,500 nuclear warheads aimed at each other. If a single accident had occurred, the world could have been destroyed. Let's rewind to the origins of the Cold War. In March 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited the United States to deliver his famous Iron Curtain speech. He pointed out that historic cities such as Warsaw, Berlin, and Budapest had fallen under Stalin's control, and claimed this posed a threat of Eastern Orthodox civilization to Christian civilization. This speech laid an important public opinion foundation for the Cold War. In March 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman delivered a State of the Union address to Congress. The proposal of the Truman Doctrine marked the full breakdown of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, officially starting the Cold War. In the early years of the Cold War, the United States was highly confident and hardly considered the Soviet Union a serious threat. The reason was clear. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people in World War II, and even if Stalin intended to resist, the country lacked the strength. Before Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union always maintained a defensive strategic posture. The United States, on the other hand, led the world in economy, industry, and military power. Truman even declared that America was the strongest nation since the dawn of humanity. Moreover, major inventions in the second half of the 19th century, such as the telegraph, telephone, and radio, largely came from the United States, which made Americans even less likely to see the Soviet Union as a real opponent. This advantage lasted for 10 years. The turning point came in 1957, during the administration of President Eisenhower. On October 4th of the same year, the Soviet Union announced through TASS that it had successfully launched an artificial satellite. The satellite was only half a meter in diameter, essentially a transmitter with a few broken antennas. But it shocked Americans because it directly proved that the Soviet Union had achieved a lead in critical technology. This event had a psychological impact on Americans comparable to the stock market crash of 1929. On November 3, 1957, the Soviet Union completed another astonishing feat: sending a dog into space. At that time, humanity was still exploring satellite technology, and the Soviet ability to send a living being into space shattered America's sense of technological superiority. Some Americans even began to question the competitive advantage of the capitalist system. President Eisenhower, upon seeing the satellite, told his secretary that he wanted to hang the head of the U.S. Bureau of the Budget for failing to allocate more funding to science. Some international law experts seriously suggested that the United States negotiate a strategic peace agreement with the Soviet Union immediately, or the Soviets might refuse to negotiate once they grew stronger. This fear was not unfounded. The Americans were genuinely afraid because Soviet spacecraft were flying over U.S. territory. If the Soviets could launch rockets into space, delivering weapons to the U.S. would be no problem. However, Soviet technological superiority was somewhat superficial. The strategic gap between the U.S. and the USSR remained large. For instance, intercontinental missiles were at a 5.1 ratio, long-range strategic bombers 8.1, and nuclear warheads 17.1. Civil infrastructure was even more unequal. Soviet leader Khrushchev understood that directly confronting the United States would be difficult. But the momentum of U.S.-Soviet rivalry was already established. Khrushchev likened it to two dogs meeting. The winner is determined by who can bluff better. When people feel insecure, they tend to seek recognition elsewhere. Khrushchev found an easy target in the newly inaugurated U.S. President Kennedy. At that time, there was also a kind of political hierarchy. For example, Stalin despised Truman because he was merely a subordinate of Roosevelt. Likewise, Khrushchev looked down on Kennedy, seeing him as inexperienced, a kid. Indeed, Kennedy had little political experience, becoming president due to his charisma and the influence of his wealthy father. Soon, the two leaders met at a conference in Vienna. Khrushchev had a psychological advantage from the start. He pointed at Kennedy and said, "I voted for you once." Kennedy was stunned, thinking he had somehow become a Soviet spy. During the meeting, Khrushchev's behavior left everyone shocked. Vice President Johnson later said that Khrushchev had intimidated Kennedy so much that it nearly gave him a heart attack. Khrushchev lectured Kennedy constantly, using seniority and experience to pressure him. Kennedy initially remained on the defensive. But near the end of the meeting, he calmly responded to Khrushchev's aggressive attitude. "Mr. Chairman, you seem very interested in our deployments in Europe." Although it sounded casual, it subtly implied sarcasm, reminding Khrushchev of U.S. nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey, which directly threatened the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's face immediately darkened. He realized that although Kennedy was young, he was not defenseless. So, how did the Cuban Missile Crisis actually start? One day, Khrushchev, at his vacation villa in Ukraine, looked out at the mountains. He thought of Turkey, where countless U.S. nuclear warheads were pointed at the Soviet homeland. Feeling humiliated, he suddenly said to those around him, "Why don't we deploy our missiles near the U.S. in Cuba?" Cuba is directly opposite Florida. If the U.S. had weapons near the Soviet Union, now the Soviets could do the same. So, how did the Cuban Missile Crisis actually start? One day, Khrushchev, at his vacation villa in Ukraine, looked out at the mountains. He thought of Turkey, where countless U.S. nuclear warheads were pointed at the Soviet homeland. Feeling humiliated, he suddenly said to those around him, "Why don't we deploy our missiles near the U.S. in Cuba?" Cuba is directly opposite Florida. If the U.S. had weapons near the Soviet Union, now the Soviets could do the same. In 1959, internal unrest led to Batista being overthrown by revolutionary leader Fidel Castro. However, this alone did not trigger the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro initially visited the United States after the revolution and was warmly welcomed by the public. His unique leadership and foreign charm even fascinated American young women. But the U.S. government did not receive him for 10 days, which was humiliating. Americans distrusted him, believing he was secretly supported by the Soviets. Cuba, a small country next to the U.S., could not survive independently under such pressure. In 1961, Castro was forced to turn to the Soviet Union. This made the U.S. regard him as a thorn in their side. In the same year, Kennedy tried to retaliate with the Bay of Pigs invasion, funding and arming Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. The operation failed, humiliating the U.S. and costing 62 million pesos, the only war compensation in U.S. history. Back to Khrushchev. Cuba had become the Soviet Union's ally. If the U.S. deployed missiles near the USSR, the Soviets could do the same in Cuba. Khrushchev approved Operation Anadir, secretly transporting 162 nuclear warheads to Cuba, including 60 medium-range ballistic missiles, 80 short-range cruise missiles, and numerous bombers and launch vehicles. He even authorized General Pliev, the Soviet commander in Cuba, to use tactical nuclear weapons if U.S. forces invaded and communication with Moscow was lost. The U.S. was completely unaware of this, estimating only a few hundred Soviet troops were in Cuba. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance plane captured clear photographs of missile launchers in western Cuba, shocking Washington. On October 16th, the CIA presented the photos to Kennedy, who, already exhausted from public scrutiny over Marilyn Monroe's death, muttered, "That Khrushchev is a real fool." At the National Security Council, Air Force Chief LeMay advocated a full airstrike, while Secretary McNamara worried this could trigger nuclear war and suggested a naval blockade. After 4 days of deliberation, Kennedy chose the blockade. On the evening of October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation on television, revealing the Soviet offensive missile deployment and announcing a naval quarantine from October 24th. The U.S. military entered DEFCON 2, the only time during the Cold War it reached this level. 3,500 nuclear warheads were ready. 90,000 troops assembled in Florida, prepared to invade Cuba. Khrushchev responded quickly, calling the blockade an act of piracy, ordering ships to proceed, and accelerating missile assembly. U.S. ships enforced the quarantine, with 90 vessels ready and radar tracking every approaching ship. Some Soviet ships turned back, but 16 continued, and one even breached the blockade, reaching Cuba. Public panic erupted in the U.S., with people stockpiling supplies, fearing nuclear war. At this stage, both leaders were very cautious. For example, the U.S. used the term quarantine instead of blockade, while Khrushchev ordered ships carrying military equipment to turn back. Soviet media first condemned U.S. imperialism, then shifted to advocating caution and peace. The crisis reached its peak on October 27th, Black Saturday, with several near catastrophes. One U.S. plane, supposedly for atmospheric sampling, went off course and entered Soviet airspace. Soviet officers considered intercepting it, but Khrushchev intervened, realizing it might have strayed by accident. At the same time, a U-2 reconnaissance plane over Cuba was shot down. Under pre-existing plans, this would have triggered an attack on the missile sites. Kennedy judged it likely an accident and held back. Also, on Black Saturday, a Soviet submarine encountered severe danger. The U.S. Navy dropped depth charges as a warning. The submarine's systems failed, the crew feared war had broken out, and the commander ordered the launch of a nuclear torpedo. Deputy Vasily Arkhipov insisted they had no authority without Moscow's orders, preventing a nuclear escalation. Arkhipov is now called the man who saved the world. After surfacing, the submarine contacted the U.S. Navy. Kennedy ordered restraint and consulted former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, eventually deciding to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev also broadcast a global call for calm. The Cuban Missile Crisis sent a deafening warning to all major powers. Great power rivalry must respect limits, and even minor conflicts can become triggers for disaster. Nations must maintain communication to preserve ultimate safety in the nuclear era. Interestingly, after the crisis, Khrushchev and Kennedy became friends. Once the Red Hotline was established, Khrushchev even invited Kennedy to the USSR to taste authentic Ukrainian wine. Kennedy agreed, but tragically, 3 months later, he died.